We are just delighted that you are here with us as in our third session with the color of education. And we would like to begin by thanking our sponsors today. I'm Marianne Wolf. I should tell you that. I'm the president and executive director of the Public School Forum. And our team here looks so forward to every single session along with our partners. But thank you so much to our Color of Education supporters. As you can see on the screen, we are very grateful to their support and efforts that allow us to have these discussions that we believe are so important as we pursue equity in our schools. We also want to mention that we have two partners in this work, if we look at that next slide, and who have been very integral to this. So the Cook Center on Social Equity, and also the Duke Sanford School and Center for Child and Family Policy. So we are very grateful to have these partners who work with us, as well as a guiding committee of many leaders in this field. As you know, many of you have already joined us for two of these sessions, and today is the third one. But in your email and in your Eventbrite, you also can go back and listen to the previous sessions if you had a conflict or weren't able to join us. And so we hope that you will take the time to do that. You'll also notice if you follow the Color of Education hashtag, you will be able to see not just previous conversations, but also ongoing conversations of this work. So we hope you will, throughout this, share on the Color of Education hashtag. And you also can see the different partners represented there with their Twitter handles. We also have an opportunity for you to share your questions for panelists in the Q&A that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I think it's probably at the bottom, and we will definitely be monitoring that. But you also can show your reflections in the chat. And so we really found it helpful to give people that space to respond and share and kind of pose ideas as we're listening to these wonderful panelists today. And so the one other thing I wanted to mention to you is that after we have this plenary session, which we're about to kick off, you will have an option to go to one of two breakout sessions. But remember, even though it's almost impossible to decide between these two wonderful breakout sessions, you will be able to go back and listen to the one that you don't go to. So you will have access to that information. And we're very, very excited about that. So for the one on school policies and discipline disparities, you're actually going to stay in this room, in this session. And then if you want to go to the one about creating positive school climate, you actually have another, we'll share the link in the chat, and you also receive that in your email. And so it's very seamless. We had no trouble doing this last week, so we're very excited about that as well. And I believe those are all the updates and the logistics I wanted to share with you today, but I'm very pleased now to introduce to you Dr. Keisha Bentley Edwards, who is both a partner and thought partner for all of this work. She's the Associate Director of Research at Duke University's Cook Center on Social Equity, and I feel like I learn every time she speaks. And so with that, Keisha, it is my pleasure to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. Well, I'll join everyone in welcoming you to the Color of Education's 2020 virtual event. Be prepared to have frank conversations about race, racism, and school disciplinary practices today. And although we often think about boys in the context of racial disparities in discipline, I also want to make sure we think about girls, particularly Black girls, and our Indigenous girls as well. And because they are disproportionately affected by school disciplinary practices. And with the transition to virtual, many school disciplinary practices have evolved in the COVID-19 era in ways that maintain punitive practices. So for instance, prior to COVID, the top two reasons that Black girls were punished in school was for dress code violations and for perceived insubordination. And these, in some school districts, have evolved their school codes of conduct in the virtual setting in ways that can continue these same disparities. So I think we're going to have a very exciting conversation today. We are going to open up with a session with Professor Barbara Fetters, and then we'll continue on with our student panel on this topic that will be led by Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock. And I always love hearing students advocate for themselves. I know you will too. So before that, let me tell you a bit briefly about Barbara Fetters. Professor Fetters is an assistant professor of law and the director of the Youth Justice Clinic at the University of North Carolina School of Law. Writing and teaching in the areas of juvenile justice, school discipline, racial equity, and policing. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Fetters into our group, into the Color of Education. And here you go.
Great. Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be part of this conversation around the purposes of school policing. And I think the summer of protest against racist police violence has really spurred a rethinking of how we define safety, whose safety we prioritize, and the most effective way to ensure safety, not only in our communities, but in our schools. Next slide, please. So what I want to do today in my time is to talk about how school policing works, what, if any, are the safety benefits of school policing, what are the political, cultural, and economic non-safety factors that explain the rise of school policing, what are the harms, what are the regulatory tools for minimizing those harms, and then to close by briefly looking at how the school policing landscape has changed really just since the summer. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we mean by school police? So nationally, there are really two main ways that school districts have police officers in schools. And so the first is in very large urban districts such as Los Angeles and Houston. You have school districts actually running their own police departments. Much more commonly, in what we have in North Carolina, is the practice of partnering between school districts and either police departments or sheriff's departments. Next slide, please. At the state level, the Department of Public Instruction envisions school police officers, or SROs, school resource officers, not only as law enforcement officers, but also as law-related counselors and teachers. And both federal and state law conceptualize SROs as people who are permanently embedded in public schools, not as in the case of some private schools, that the school determines whether and when to bring police officers in. Instead, an SRO spends the day at a school. Next slide, please. All right, so statewide, who are school resource officers? So according to a 2015 census, 80% of them are male, 77% are white, and they are an aggregate age of 42 years old. Next slide, please. Okay, so school police officers are actually a relatively historically new phenomenon. The first known officer was hired by a school in the early 1950s, but it remained very rare for the following 3 decades. But beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that started to change dramatically. Next slide, please. So why? Why is it that law enforcement in schools is going up? The National Association of School Resource Officers estimates that school policing is the fastest growing area of law enforcement. So the answer appears to be first, that in that time period that I just mentioned, the late 80s and the early 90s, that was the time of widespread kind of media flamed, politician flamed hysteria about juvenile super predators. This was a time of a very pronounced but ultimately short-lived increase in arrest rates among youth. And while these arrests occurred across demographics, the super predator was clearly in the minds of the public, really, because this was convenient, I think, politically, a black male. And the predictions that a number of very fancy pedigreed academics made about the fact that juvenile crime would continue to rise because the era of the super predator was upon us turned out to be false. As I mentioned, that increase in arrests was short-lived. Crime and arrests went down, but none of those academics suffered any negative career consequences for having been so disastrously wrong and having ushered in really an era of much stricter, harsher criminal punishment and also school-based consequences for getting in trouble. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is the occurrence of mass school shootings in K through 12 schools. So in 1999, two students killed 12 of their classmates, one teacher, and themselves at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. It was not the first mass school shooting, but at the time it was the deadliest. So I want to pause here just to say that as with many of the subsequent mass school shootings, the victims in this case were mostly white and middle class. And perhaps because of these demographic factors, mass school shootings generate widespread media coverage and outrage, certainly disproportionate to that which follows gun violence that occurs in communities where the victims are non-white and non-middle class. So the media coverage generated by Columbine, combined with the fact that it occurs kind of on the tail end of this so-called super predator era, it helps explain, I think, that the explosion really in school policing. And this is true. So school police officers have continued to go up, notwithstanding the fact that crime in schools has either stayed the same or actually gone a little bit down. All right, let me just make sure I'm where. Yeah, I think we might need to go 2 slides forward. Yeah, okay. So do SROs keep students safe? This is what everyone wants to know. And the answer is that it really depends on what study you read. I think the most that we can fairly say about whether or not there's a positive safety benefit associated with having SROs is that the evidence really is mixed. So what is the brief for school policing proponents? It is probably intuitively that highly visible, uniformed, armed police officers act as a deterrent to would-be external assailants, as well as the commission of crime by current students. And so the belief is that, especially when aided by threat assessment tools and high-tech surveillance technology products, that officers can ascertain who in a school population is most likely to be dangerous in the future. But as I said, the evidence really points in all different directions. And there's not a lot of it. There's actually, considering how long we've had school police officers, there's not a ton of research. One study from 2009 that's widely cited showed that schools with police saw a decrease in assault and weapons charges, but a study from a decade later showed pretty much the opposite conclusion. Additionally, studies that purport to show an objective safety benefit, actually, when you dig deep, really are just showing subjective perceptions of safety on the part of students, parents, and staff. And importantly, feelings of safety are not static and do not arise in a vacuum. So students who have trauma and victimization histories, students who've had negative experiences with officers outside of school are going to feel less safe around school police than do their peers without those histories. And those students, of course, are disproportionately Black students, Native American students, Latinx students, and low-income students. Additionally, there's a number of methodological problems in the study of the relationship between school police and safety. There's a lot of purely qualitative or ethnographic research. The quantitative work is limited by small sample sizes and a lack of a control group. And fifth and finally, the question of whether and how a police presence prevents gun violence is very difficult to study because school shootings are so rare. But it is a fact that 2 of the most notorious school shootings, Columbine and Parkland, occurred when SROs were on duty. Next slide, please. So what my research shows is that there are a number of other factors in addition to hoped for safety benefits that explain the rise of school policing. The first is that there's money for it. federal and state legislatures allocate money for police officers that is not available for other kinds of staff and resources to ensure student safety, such as school-based mental health staff. So there's an ACLU report called Cops Not Counselors it's worth looking at that really lays this out, how many students nationwide are in schools with police officers, but no counselors, social workers, nurses, or school psychologists. But I think especially educators who are on the call know that investing in school-based mental health staff is investing in safety. That we know today's students suffer more anxiety and depression and have experienced more trauma than students of any preceding generation. And we know that whenever we go back to school, it's only going to be worse. And a robust staff of mental health folks can help students achieve more academically, incur fewer disciplinary infractions, and feel more connected to their schools, which is a way to prevent crime and violence. So a second reason that school policing has gone up is what folks call security theater. So just the desire to appear tough. So the really kind of classic example of this is TSA. So the folks that you see at the airport doing with metal detectors and looking at your shoes, and whether or not these things actually work is really less important than the fact that they make people, or at least some people, feel safer. And I think that the temptation has to be great on the part of school administrations to want to seem tough, whether or not the empirical evidence really exists to support the idea that police do actually make things safer. And then the last thing is legitimacy building on the part of law enforcement. So one might think that it's only schools that benefit from or seek out school police partnerships, but in fact, the historical record is full of examples of police departments wanting their officers to be in schools. So in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there were a couple different places, South Central, Watts, and even Charlotte, North Carolina, where there were very poor community police relations. And the police saw it as being in their interest to put kind of officer friendlies in the schools to try to improve the opinion in which communities of color held police, and also, frankly, to gather intelligence. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the harms of school policing? So lots of folks on the call, and yes, I'm happy to share this presentation. Lots of folks on the call, I was trying to watch the chats as they were coming in, mention the school to prison pipeline, and that is, I think, the most well-known harm of school policing. So I've mentioned that the evidence for a safety benefit is really mixed, but it is clear that schools that have police officers are more likely to send youth to juvenile and criminal court for minor misconduct than schools without police officers. The biggest one is disorderly conduct, and that makes so much sense if you have ever spent any time around children and adolescents. It is very easy to commit disorderly conduct, particularly in some states. North Carolina is one of them. The definition is very broad, and the crime calls for a lot of subjective interpretation on the part of officers. So is it disorderly to refuse to follow the coach's order during PE to change out into gym clothes or to do jumping jacks, or is it just being a kid? And you might think that that's a real teachable moment and that the teacher should handle it, but the fact is that school police officers work for and are accountable to police departments or sheriff's departments, not to the school. And so it could be that they decide to let the teacher handle it, but they can also decide not to. And so that's why I think you see such great rates of referral for disorderly conduct, because it does require so much interpretation on the part of officers. And the racial disparities in this crime are crazy. They're off the charts, which unfortunately, again, is not surprising. But in addition, I think to the school to prison pipeline is something that I just hinted at earlier, which is that when you have a police officer embedded in a school, it at least has the potential to interfere with school governance. I just mentioned that we would want, I think, for principals, assistant principals, or teachers to decide how to handle classroom misbehavior, hallway misbehavior. And in some cases, that decision is taken from them by having embedded police officers. Additionally, I think, and here's where I'll close, and just because I want to make sure to leave time for the great student panel that's coming up, but even if you have, so where my kids go to school, where I live, Chapel Hill, Carborough, I believe the district has a very good document in place with the police, a memorandum of understanding, and other districts do too, that seek to really limit the amount of involvement that a school police officer can have in routine classroom misbehavior. But the thing about those documents is that they're not enforceable contracts, by parents or other school community stakeholders. And they almost always have loopholes for police to decide in their discretion to basically ignore everything in the document. And so really these MOUs are only as good as the goodwill of the officers who are working in a particular school. And so I think what ends up happening, so Chapel Hill Carborough, sorry, I got a little distracted there. Chapel Hill Carborough has done a good job at limiting the number of arrests that occur from school police officers, but that does not mean that there aren't still harms, because there are. And I think there are kind of day-to-day, verbal intimidation, mean looks, the ways in which officers can just conduct themselves and walk around a school, and just the relentless kind of focus on the usual suspects. So kids of color, poor kids, and that really sends a damaging message to all kids. I mean, there's concrete, obvious harms for the kids who are being targeted, but the problem also is that white and middle class kids internalize this idea that the real danger in a school, and then by extension in a community, are these kind of other kids. And so I think that that's inaccurate. And when we think about schools as having actual curriculum, but also hidden curriculum in terms of the messages and the values that are being transmitted, school policing, I think, plays an unfortunate and often negative part of that. We can have lots of debates about whether or not the costs outweigh the benefits or not. I think ultimately that every district has to make those decisions on their own. But I wanted to just share these thoughts based on my research about what I think of are the costs, which often don't get discussed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Fetters, for your comments, especially talking about the theater impact. I like talking about the different programs around anti-drug enforcement, like the DARE program that makes adults feel good, but it actually is ineffective. And that's exactly what you're talking about. So I appreciate the way that you really laid it out for everyone to understand. So next, we are going to transition to our panel. And I wanted to do a very brief introduction of our moderator. So Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock is a co-founder and lead curator of We Are, which stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. She leads programs, camps, trainings, workshops. Look, I'm impressed by Dr. Bullock every day. So thank you so much for being here and for leading this discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bentley Edwards. It is truly a pleasure to be here. And really the honor is being able to moderate a panel with so many promising young people who already have a demonstrated history of doing work right now, being activists and advocating on behalf of students. And so thank you all so much for this opportunity. And really, we're going to go ahead and hop in. We're building upon a great presentation to kind of set the context. And so now let's go ahead and just hear from the panelists. And so we're going to allow them to introduce themselves and just share some of their leadership background info. And so Reagan, let's go ahead and start with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Reagan Rezan. Currently, I am an executive at large of the Wake County Black Student Coalition, which is targeted to unite all Wake County students in really dismantling the systemic racism that infiltrates our education system. Before joining the Wake County Black Student Coalition, along with 3 other peers, I co-authored a petition that aimed to really re-examine the role of school resource officers in Wake County schools. And currently that petition has over 7,000 signatures. However, we're shifting away from this petition and more towards pushing for our proposal for peace builders, which we worked on with the Education Justice Alliance, Youth Justice Project of Social Coalition for Social Justice, and the ACLU of North Carolina. And I'm excited to be talking with you all today about policing in schools.
Yes, thank you, Reagan. Seth.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Seth Bellamy. I am a senior at SOSA, which is a school here in Asheville, North Carolina. And there I am the student body president and also the co-founder and co-president of Keeping It Real, Racial Equity Activating Leadership, which is the first racial equity club at our school and within our school system. And I'm also the co-founder and also one of the student leaders within the Racial Equity Ambassadors Program, where we empower students to teach teachers about cultural competency and racial equity and how to be anti-racist actively within the school system. And so thank you all for allowing us to be here. I'm excited to talk to you all about my experiences with policing in schools.
And then lastly, Greer.
Good evening, everybody. I'm glad to be here with you all and be here on this panel with these other exceptional students. My name is Greer Webb. I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm currently a sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. I'm majoring in political science and African American studies, AAAD, which stands for African American and Diaspora Studies. I'm also the co-founder of North Carolina Town Hall, an initiative to allow students to lead the conversation around school safety following the Parkland school shooting of 2018, as well as Young Americans Protest, which seeks to give all North Carolina young people an opportunity to affect policy change. In my time at Sanderson High School in Raleigh, I also worked to create the first ever student equity team at Sanderson. And I'm glad to be a part of this conversation today and talk about policing in schools and everything that is involved in that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. And as all of our listeners can hear, you all are doing the work, and you're not waiting to become adults to do things. Like, you're doing the work now. So that's so inspirational. We can't wait to hear more from you all. So as we're sitting here talking about this particular topic and in discussing policing in schools and discipline disparities, we often talk about arrests or suspensions, but what are the other ways where students are experiencing policing in schools? And what is policing, and what does this even mean to you all? So what are these other ways that kids are experiencing policing in schools? Reagan, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you. So as you said, while we talk about, literal policing in schools, which is police in schools, it's important for us to talk about the more insidious ways that we police Black and Brown students, especially Black girls, as Ms. Keisha mentioned in the beginning. This comes from adultification bias, which is where Black girls get dress coded more often than their white peers, or we get disciplined at higher rates for doing things that people our age usually do. So with this, when I was in kindergarten, I was playing tag, running down the hallway. And you're not supposed to be running down the hallway, but when your friend is chasing you, what are you supposed to do? At the end of this, I ended up getting in trouble. And sadly, I was the only one who got in trouble. I got sent to the thinking table. And while getting sent to the thinking table doesn't mean that much, you just sit and think about your actions. If you step back and look at the grand scheme of things, why was I the only one that was targeted from this event? In addition to events like this that a lot of Black girls experience, there's the comments like, you should straighten your hair to look more professional, or you sound white. These might go unnoticed for some people, but it really displays our societal expectations of professionalism, and how from that Blackness and the associated physical traits are seen as unprofessional and inferior. So this just speaks to just the various informal and formal ways that we police student identity, especially Blackness and Black student identity. And I just think that it's really important that we discuss this.
No, and Reagan, I like how you're talking about not only just how you're showing up in the building and whether you're breaking a rule or not, you're talking about these microaggressions, about how particularly Black girls are allowed or not allowed to wear our own hair. And I'm so glad that you resist those norms that have been placed on you. Seth, can you add on to this one?
Right. And thank you, Reagan, for bringing out a really important topic, which is assimilation. And I believe that is a common tool and hidden curriculum within schools. And so within my school system and many school systems across the nation, tracking is used to make sure that we are making students reach a certain standard and make sure that we're following their ways and so they can be college ready. But that can be expanded into how we're tracking students discipline wise. And so, Reagan, you brought up a great experience about how vagrant laws are kind of implemented into schools, where students, especially students of color, are being disciplined, especially when they're highly visible, especially when they're Black males, and have to abide by laws and abide by rules that other students get to walk away from with leisure. And so it's very important for us to understand how assimilation is a very important part of the hidden curriculum of schools. And we know that the vast majority of educators within the school system are white women. And so, of course, in the classroom, Black males who oppose just white women are going to be hyper vigilant, visible, and will account for it, especially within discipline disparities. And so it's very important for us to recognize that students who will not be able to understand how to play the game, understand how to talk and change their tone of voice to meet their expectations, students who may exhibit some gifted talents that was seen in white people is considered to be, oh, he's not able to do work because it's just beneath him. So we're going to put him in accelerate learning. But instead, for African American students in the work, well, that's just a major issue that we need to deal with and put them in a lower course. And so there's just all these mounting issues that are placed upon African American students at such a young age. And this continual question of why African American students are not engaged in school, or why don't they go out for other school clubs, or why don't they participate in class? But every single time I try to take that step into achieving what you want me to be, I'm taking and not back down 5 steps because I do not the visual and also the structural and cultural ways of what you want me to be. And so when we talk about policing, it's very important how we rely on our own implicit biases to judge our Black and people of color as you.
Wow. I mean, just in y'all's first two responses, I'm laughing, but it's not funny. Like, we could do a whole other panel on policing of kids' bodies that don't actually involve the police yet. That's what I hear. Oh my goodness, Seth, like, you're dropping such great knowledge about, first of all, assimilation. Like, Black and brown kids are being punished for not assimilating to whiteness. Like, what century is this? What century is this to where those are the expectations that kids are being held to? I mean, you're talking about the makeup of the teachers versus the makeup of the students. I mean, just so many things there that we as educators need to hear. Grill, I want to hear from you as well.
Sure, I'll quickly jump in here. I think Reagan and Seth hit it directly on the head, but I did see a comment in the chat about how does university and the college level policing kind of differ or include some of these same things. And so as a sophomore student, I still remember high school well down in Raleigh. And so to just understand that, at various levels, the police also police protest and students that speak out and try to go against the norm, against the grain at all levels, even that is policed. And so even when students, particularly of color, attempt to speak out, they're silenced. And an example that sticks out in my head is the walkouts in 2018. I bet you all remember when students were leading around the nation and encouraging their peers to walk out just for a few moments at a certain time to remember the Parkland tragedy and to really say that, we don't want to be killed in our places of learning anymore. We had police officers across Wake County who were trying to put limitations on those walkouts that tried to not only discourage them, but say that it made their jobs harder, as opposed to students who are not able to do our jobs and learn because we're allowing these guns and these people, mainly whites, to come in and target us as students. And so that's frustrating. At the university level here at UNC Chapel Hill, I'm sure many of us here in North Carolina are aware of the Silent Sam issue and the way that the Chapel Hill, the town, as well as Chapel Hill, the school, and their police departments work together to police protest again. And so as we see after the Breonna Taylor murder, as well as some of the other recent events, even though students haven't been in school recently, at the beginning of this quarantine period, there were students at UNC Chapel Hill, mainly the Black student groups that masked up and went out to protest. And there were some run-ins with the UNC Chapel Hill police as to where the students would be allowed to go. And the students wanted to have amiable conversation with the police about ways in which they could behave differently on campus, because still they're seen as this antagonizational force, right? Not a force to be partnered with when it comes to students at UNC Chapel Hill. Even just briefly, even on the first day of school, when they were trying to send students back at the college level this year, the police were the ones that greeted students at the door. And so we've really got to tackle in this state the militarization and the ways in which we in our own communities are allowing the police to really run rampant and police everything from the way that students wear their hair to the way that students speak out against the ways in which they don't feel supported in schools. And so this is an important conversation, and I'm glad to be here again. And I believe that Seth and Reagan hit it on the head. We've really got to analyze the way in which we're supporting all of our students, but understanding how history plays into how we're all affected.
Right. And you all are also letting us know that we have our work cut out for us as educators. Like, we have our work cut out for us, and we need to listen to the young people, because you all have the answers. So from you all's perspectives, how does racial bias, like some of you hinted at this earlier, but how does racial bias and actions play a role in discipline disparities and in policing in schools? And Seth, we're gonna go with you first.
So I kind of mentioned this earlier, but because we are living in a society where we still have pockets of communities that are able to isolate themselves and not have that connection between different races or different identities, we have biases that are built up regardless of who we are. And so when that enters the school, we have students who are able to rely on our school system to create those bubbles and create those biases within it. And so let's just take down AP and honors classes within our school system. And I know many, just the country, you have students who are able to create a cohort of homogeneity within each and every class. And so you have nothing but white students and possibly a token. And so we would say those are African American students, or a student that just has a different identity who is within that cohort. And within all of them, you have that bias, and you have that idea where we are able to be better than you only because look at around you. We have a system that's confirming the biases of our students. And so when you have a system that's confirming white supremacy and confirming that you see that white students are smarter than Black students because of where they are, it's just a continuum of what is happening within the past, but how it's becoming contemporary. And so that has a really strong intersection with policing, because if a student, and I know I have spoken out within classes and they're not being affirmed by the teacher, their experiences are saying that happens in a vacuum, and they try to speak out more and more and advocate for themselves, they're seen as belligerent or being disorderly. And so we have that good trouble that's happening, but that has real world implications and ramifications for those students. And so more likely than not, you have that Black male student who is now being pushed down and made sure to be belittled within that classroom and is not able to speak up. And when he does, it's out of character, or it is considered to not be articulate, considered to be you're not being a credit to your race. And so we have these continuous biases and continuous drudging up of the past that we thought we are coming to a non-racial era, but honestly, it's continuously embedded in our school system, and it's continuously embedded in our biases. And so that is also being interplayed with the teacher and interface with how they interact with students, and are more likely to call on people who represent who they are, who can confirm their own beliefs, especially in classes with humanities. You have that conversation where we are talking about this different experience. We're talking about something about human nature. But if your only human nature that you're being exposed to is confirming your identity, why would you talk, or why would you include someone in the conversation that goes against that or takes down that notch of the American dream, per se, within the Great Gatsby? And so that just needs to come up and be embedded within our school system and impact the Black students, especially with how they speak and how they show up in the classroom.
Listen, you said a whole word there, Seth. Just thinking about how this impacts racial identity construction, right? And how it impacts and fulfills self-confirming biases, and the structure of the schools, and how the AP and honors classes and IB classes are set up structurally from the academic track classes, and how do those fall along racial lines? Thanks for making that visible for us. Reagan, I also like to hear from you on this one.
Yes, so like Seth said, I strongly believe that racial bias leads directly to these disparities in discipline. This summer with MIT, I did some research and we found that with schools that are more white, the feel is that the resource officers are there to protect the students from outside threats. But then when we look at schools that are predominantly brown and black, the resource officers are there to protect students from themselves and from violent students. And I feel like this really highlights the racial biases because at the end of the day, we're all susceptible to these outside threats. But when we're focusing more on criminalizing students rather than protection, that's where we really go wrong here. And recently, one of our resource officers at my school, he was kind of highlighted for saying a comment. And the comment was, "Do you know how to catch a criminal? You see who kneels during the anthem." And this comment, it hit a lot of people hard because he equates not only standing up for what you believe in with criminality, but he also kind of just like, I don't know why that was something that needs to be said, but that highlights how these little racial biases will manifest into actions that could turn into a chokehold on a Tuesday or something. So I think it's important that we really crack down on, you know, what people say and why they're saying them. And that's important to add to the conversation.
And you're right, Reagan. These little offhanded jokes, they're not just jokes, particularly when it's coming from a person in power and a person with a gun. A person, not just a random person with a gun, but a person who is given access and authority to have that gun and to be in community with children. And I'm so sorry that you all at your school experienced that. I'm glad it was made visible, and whoever heard it knew that this was something that needed to be reported. And I'm glad you all know that is not normal and that is unacceptable. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we're thinking about these impacts, right? That's what Reagan is bringing up, the impacts of policing in schools. And what do you all think the impact is on students, on the social emotional health and well-being, academics, mental and physical state? Greer, what are your thoughts on that, on the impact on students?
I think there's a tremendous impact on students, all students, and specifically students of color and our Black students, as we, understand the history that I mentioned previously with policing coming from the idea of slave catching and returning Black bodies to plantations. I think that you can't really escape that reality. And so for students such as myself and many of my peers, it can be scary at times. Not only scary, but we internalize that fear and that less than idea that Reagan is speaking about. And so to understand that not only on its face to see these officers with guns out patrolling, and from my understanding and from what I've seen, just using an I statement here, to see them breaking up fights and arresting my Black and brown friends, we see, as Professor Fetters mentioned, that they don't, on the whole, prevent school shootings, that they really don't form genuine partnerships that continue in the community after students graduate. And so really, what is their purpose? And so to understand that while they're there interacting with these students, it's taking a tremendous toll on the mental health of students, particularly Black and brown students, on the physical health of students. I mean, I can remember junior year of high school, I had a friend come up to me and say that he was going to a court date soon, and did I know NAACP or any representatives that could help him, because he believed that he was wrongfully arrested and the administration didn't do anything to stick up for him. This person was handcuffed in Raleigh, North Carolina, to a chair while they were figuring out what to charge him with. And this person did happen to be Black. And so to understand that, wow, that's just one account of what happens, and to imagine what his life would be like after that, I don't even know the results of his pending court trial. But to understand that these instances are not normal, right? This is not what life should be like. This is not a supportive, this is not an encouraging system that we have set up right now in our schools, where we're prioritizing breaking up fights, where we're prioritizing handcuffing students, as opposed to having a futuristic thinking of how can we be reallocating these resources to mental health? How can we provide more nurses and psychologists in our schools? How can we provide more teachers? How can we use the effort that we're putting toward recruiting police officers in schools toward recruiting teachers out of HBCUs that can reflect the students that they're teaching and encourage more students of color to get into these AP and honors classes that Seth talked about. So there is a tremendous toll on all of those things, emotionally as well. How do how would you expect one to feel when they believe they are wrongfully arrested, or even if they did do something because maybe it was a reaction to something that's going on at home or something that happened on the bus on the way to school, and then they reach out to try and become a better person, to try and understand how they're feeling, and there's no one that looks like them in the counselor's office. That takes a tremendous toll on the emotions and the mental health of students. And so at all ages, I know here in Wake County, maybe not in Raleigh, but we even have SROs in elementary schools. This just is not right, and we need to do something about it. And so I think the first step is realizing that it does take a toll, not only on the physical health of students when they're arrested and sent to the school to prison pipeline, but as they interact every day with these people who are part of a system designed to capture them.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot, right? That's a lot. It's a lot for students to have to carry. And Reagan, I want to go back to you. After sharing that incident, I'm sure you have thoughts on how, this is playing out, the policing in schools is playing out on students and impacting them.
Yeah, definitely. Like Greer was saying, I want to also offer, another perspective. In addition to policing in schools that is in our immediate environment, the impact of policing that happens just in America. I remember on Sunday, August 23rd, the shooting of Jacob Blake. That really hit me and a lot of my friends hard. So the next day in virtual school, it was kind of hard for us to focus, to turn on our cameras and participate. But another aspect with policing students is the fact that we're expecting our Black students to be present and at 100% all the time when we're watching our brothers and sisters being brutalized out in the streets. And while we're not being in school with the police near us, we're still like in that environment. So I think it's important to, that school focuses on supporting our Black trauma and our mental health. Because while it's easy for our white educators to separate themselves from what is happening in the national news and the local news, we can't really separate that from ourselves. And I think that's really important that we focus on. And then back to what I was talking about with my resource officer, one of my favorite anecdotes is that when I enter school, I see my police car right there, right by the front door. And I feel like that really conceptualizes this whole thing, is that when you first enter school, you shouldn't see a police car. You shouldn't see a police officer with a gun and a badge. You should see, the smiling faces of your teachers, of your peers. But I think the fact that that is just on the forefront really just shows how much we depend on this police state. And then when we're talking about the school to prison pipeline, we're talking about how we're funneling children from school to prison. We should also talk about how we're bringing prison to school, how we're bringing surveillance to school. Not in North Carolina, I'm not sure, but I know in New York they have different like voice recognition systems in schools to detect when people are angry. They have metal detectors. And I feel like we just really need to separate these two and stop viewing school as a violent space with violent bodies. We need to view it as, somewhere that we can really promote this growth and learning, because after all, school is really the foundation for it all. Like that's where we learn our empathy and all that. So yeah.
I mean, I know you all are in school and need to be paying attention, but you all need to be on tour talking to educators, parents, community members, policymakers in multiple spaces, because you all have just said a mouthful here. And I hope that we're all listening. And I think, going back to what you were saying, Reagan, like how are we bringing policing into schools? Right. And you offered some advice there. And so I'm gonna go to you, Seth, because I want to hear from you. What advice do you have for educators and policymakers who want to address the issues of policing and discipline disparities while they're trying to support student activism? Right. So what advice do you have there?
Right. And so I think for me to answer this question, I have to bring a point that Regan posted, is that surveillance. And so that surveillance for many students is actually continued from home. And so I know from personal experience, I'm a teen court and I'm a lawyer for teen court, which is a diversion program, which funnels and addresses the school to prison pipeline. And for many students, when they walk out the door of their home, they're being surveilled by police in their neighborhoods. And so if you get on the bus, there's also a camera. And so when you get on the school grounds, there's a camera watching you. So the moments of reprieve that they have from not being surveilled by a police force that is not exactly for them, but for community safety. But when has their community safety ever been put to the forefront? When has their safety ever been prioritized? And so there's a narrative that we're trying to protect students from, these outside forces, but what's happening is you're protecting the white mindset or the students of the system and able to protect them from black students. And that is what's happening right now. And what needs to happen is administrators, policymakers need to be receptive to what we're saying. They need to not, they need to take down the barriers of their bias that is already happening right now when we're talking, and actually listen and look through this through a lens. And that's number one. And number two, I think they need to start aggregating the data where police officers are involved. And so you need to look at it with the racial lens. You need to see how often African Americans, black males especially, are put in harm's way by these police officers. How often is a police officer asked to put their hands on a black student, regardless of what they've done, regardless of the disorderly contact or conduct, or how they spoke to a teacher? How often are you matching? You're not matching the energy of the students. You're actually causing the issue to escalate. And so, how often is it that we're having these students be on the forefront of the violence from these police officers? And also another thing, I want them to continue to engage with the community, even if not seem evident. I think it's so often to give up those community engagements, those town halls when, oh, they're not showing up. Oh, they don't want to talk to us. Why would you automatically, the first time, see someone come into your community who wants to talk only to further their bottom line and not really understand and get to the root of the issue? This is a systemic issue. It's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to change the minds of the teachers and the SROs who've been doing this for years and saying this system works. We're seeing it work, when actually black students are still being traumatized on a daily, on a yearly basis with their interactions with SROs. And so once we are able to get to a point where we're actually talking to students who've had that trauma and putting their voices to the forefront and actually listening to them and saying, we understand, we hear you, and we're going to do sustainable work to fix it, this issue is going to continue to happen and continue to spread across the nation. And yeah.
Yes, Seth, thank you. Thank you for that. And I hope that folks are taking notes like they should be, right? And, we'll have the presentation and things available for people later, and the video available later for folks who missed it, as you all were dropping these gems. So as we're, carrying everything that we've talked about, and we've talked about, this negative presence, we've talked about how safety is maintained. What does it look like to reimagine school safety? What is it, when I think about what makes your schools safe, or when I ask you all that, what is your ideal of school safety? How can we reimagine, recreate this space, where many of the things that we talked about up here are non-existent, and we don't have to face them as students? Greer, I'm gonna go to you on that one. What is your ideal school safety? What does that look like?
I think that's a great question. And I think you used a word that I really like, that's recreate. Because sometimes I feel like reimagine, people have a hard time understanding what that means, right? We hear that a lot today. Reagan spoke about it, bringing what these outside forces bring to the table sometimes into schools, right? And what does reimagining policing look like in America, period? And what does that mean for schools? So I like the word transform. How can we transform school safety into what it actually is? And that's support and encouragement for the students. And I think that looks like a variety of ways. I mean, that is what many students, including students across North Carolina, were pushing their local officials and school administrators to think about after the Parkland shooting, because we saw so vividly and so frighteningly from inside the school when a school shooting was happening. And so to take not only the gun violence perspective of that, but the historical over policing of Black and brown bodies in schools, I think we really need to continue doing what many of us on this call have heard before, and that's pushing for mental health resources for nurses and psychologists. It's pushing for students and teachers alike to work together to create positive learning environments where differing opinions are valued, and where we can really believe a true narrative about this nation and grapple with our troubling history. I mean, that's what it's going to take for Black and brown students to come to the classroom and feel supported, to feel encouraged, to feel like they can go home and do research on their own and come back and feel supported and encouraged. I think it has to be that cycle of continual support, of continual learning, of understanding. And so what does that look like tangibly? right? I feel like sometimes that's a hard question. Of course, meeting the national quota, excuse me, not quota, ratio when it comes to mental health providers, when it comes to nurses, that's a big step. But it also looks like recruiting teachers that look like students, right? That looks like the Teaching Fellows Program. It looks like really not being scared and worried. I heard from a mentor the other day that folks from an education agency, mainly white, gave off a narrative and spoke about being nervous about going to an HBCU to recruit teachers. Now, I wonder why that would be. Back to Reagan's point, we have to get comfortable in our discomfort so we can move forward in a way that really supports and encourages all students. And there has to be special attention paid to our Black and Brown students because for so long we've been ignored. And I think that's where the difference lies. I think students, of course, we've been on the front line. Young people have been on the front line of every social movement in this nation. And so we're going to continue fighting, and we're going to continue doing so as we continue to create these equity teams, as we continue to put standards in place for ourselves so that we can be better peers. But it's really time for our teachers and our governmental leaders to stand up and to wake up and say, wow, what can we do to implement and execute the ideas that our students are telling us? Because I really believe that many times, students know how we are best educated and how we are best supported, and how we can feel safe in our schools. And so just quickly, how does that look differently in virtual learning? I think somebody alluded to that in the chat. And as we go through this global pandemic and see these two viruses of the coronavirus and of racism, which started in 1619 here in this country, but long before around the world, it's so important that we consider that some of these same narratives and biases are still existing on Zoom. We see students trying to be disciplined by their white teachers across the nation for wearing hoodies. That was mentioned in the chat, for having their cameras off. And so when we talk about equity, what does that look like? Equity should be something that extends across any platform, right? It shouldn't look differently because we have to transition to Zoom versus being in the classroom. And so it's so important that we are continuing to support and encourage and uplift, really check in on our Black and Brown students as we grapple with not only the two pandemics that really engulf us, but also the issue of just being home and not being able to be in the classroom and be around our peers. I think for Black and Brown students in particular, as we also really focus on the racial injustice that continues to exist in this country, it's a difficult time for students. I'm a student and it's a difficult time for me. And so when we talk about school safety, it looks like equity, it looks like having support services for our students, and it looks like not being afraid to grapple with the historical injustices that have caused so many Black and Brown students to feel unprotected and unsafe at school, a place of learning and a place that should be solace.
Yeah. Greer, thank you. So you also highlighted that as we're reimagining safety, or changing and transforming and thinking about that language, like we have to think about policing in virtual school too, because it hasn't stopped. It looks different now, right? In the ways that we are policing Black and Brown bodies and folks from marginalized communities through Zoom. And we've seen people who have been disciplined and suspended, and these consequences for how we're in the midst of two pandemics, a racism pandemic and a COVID pandemic. And it's just a lot. It's a lot on everyone. It's a lot on educators. There's really a lot. It's a lot on students too. And we need to still be thoughtful about how discipline is being leveraged even in this space. We have time just for one question from the audience. And the question is, someone talked about, it feels as if maybe policies such as dress code policies, such as wearing hoods in school, and different types of clothing, that it's not equally enforced, right? And so someone asked, they were wondering, have you all seen or experienced this disproportionate enforcement of these dress code policies? And if you all can give us a specific example. And Reagan, I'm going to bounce that one to you.
Yes, this is a great question. I remember, so we have Spirit Week, right? And each day has a different theme. I remember we had this twin day, and me and a few friends, we all wore the same outfits. It was like athletic shorts, a t-shirt, and my friends were of different races. And I got dress coded for wearing the athletic shorts because they were too short on me, whereas they did not get dress coded. So I think that just really highlights how when we're wearing the same exact outfit, it's seen differently on me than it is on my white peers. And that could be due to, the over-sexualization of Black girls, how we're seen as less, how we're seen as less innocent and such.
Yeah. Anyone, Seth, do you want to hop in here for just maybe a 30-second answer? Do you have anything to add there?
Sure. And I can't really speak to dress code. I understand that I have some privilege with that and not having to deal with that vagrant use of sexualization of me. But I do understand that there is a level of that pipeline, and sometimes we don't talk about the implications of that. And so, as a person who's on the teen court, I see students who go through that disorderly conduct, and Greer mentioned this about students fighting. But then I see them go through my program with that diversion program. But if a student and if a teacher does not meet and understand that that school does not happen in a vacuum, and that a student actively acts out one day and goes against where rule regulations are supposed to meet while on a sense of parole with this juvenile court, there have been times where I've seen students chained. I've seen them resemble our ancestors and have been chained to each other and walk through the courthouse with chains and linking to each other in pain. And I think right now we're in a time where we're recognizing and we're having a reckoning with race. But what's happening right now, we are still having students experience racism as we speak. We have students in juvenile hall. We have adults in prison right now being exposed to COVID. And so all of this isn't happening only at one point of time. It's not every other year. It's happening as we speak. And so we have to move with a sense of urgency with addressing these issues.
And what a note to end on. We have to move with a sense of urgency. Enough is enough. The time is now. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Reagan, Seth, and Greer. You all were phenomenal and amazing. And it was just really awesome to hear from you all, again, who are young people in high school, in college, and you all are doing the work. You all are making good trouble. And I hope that you continue to do so. And I hope that you all find support in the dedicated educators who believe in you all and want to support you all and stand alongside you as you're trying to do this work of dismantling the school to prison pipeline, dismantling discipline disparities and disproportionate outcomes that are happening to Black and brown kids in schools. Thank you all out there so much for tuning in. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you all again. It's truly been a pleasure.
Thank you.